I want to tell you about the year my father's vineyard nearly got me arrested, made me the most hated man on my street, and ended up exposing something I never expected. And I'll warn you now, this isn't the story you think it is at the start. It changes shape about 4 different times before it's over. My dad planted that vineyard 31 years ago. 4 acres on the edge of the neighborhood, before there was even an HOA to put a sign on the entrance. When he passed, I inherited it, and with it, about 1,000 memories of him out there at 6 in the morning, hands in the dirt, telling me these vines would outlive both of us if I treated them right. So when I started finding footprints cutting straight through the 3rd row, through the Cabernet vines he'd babied since before I could drive, I figured it was nothing. Dog walkers, kids cutting through, it'd stop on its own. It didn't stop. Vine ties kept turning up snapped. Then one morning, I caught her mid-stride. Karen Doyle, our HOA president, earbuds in, walking through my vineyard like it was a sidewalk. When I called out, she pulled one earbud loose, smiled like I was the unreasonable one, and said, "Everyone's walked this path for years. It's basically the community trail at this point." Like that settled it. Like my father's land was public property because enough people had decided to treat it that way. I let it go for a while because confronting Karen felt like confronting the whole neighborhood. She ran the block parties, she remembered every kid's name, she was the kind of person you didn't want to be the villain in front of, so I just watched it pile up. Until the morning, I walked out and found a wooden stake hammered into the ground near the back row with a laminated sign zip-tied to it. Future Community Garden Expansion approved by HOA. On my land, with my vines still growing 6 feet away from it. That's when I actually went to her door instead of just yelling across a fence. She didn't even flinch. She pulled out a manila folder, neighbor signatures, a little hand-drawn site map, the works, and told me the board had voted to formalize the existing community footpath into a proper shared-use trail, and that most of the block had already signed on in support. I stood there with that folder in my hands, feeling like I'd missed an entire meeting about my own property. So I did something I probably should have done months ago. I knocked on Mr. Ruiz's door, 2 houses down, the only neighbor who'd been there longer than my dad had been gone. And what he told me knocked the wind out of me a little. Back in '99, after the flood washed out the county road for almost 2 months, my father had quietly told a handful of neighbors they could cut through the back corner of the vineyard to reach the main road. No paperwork, just his word. Your dad was a good man. He never made a thing out of it. For a few days, I genuinely felt like the bad guy. Maybe Karen wasn't lying. Maybe there really was some old, informal right that I'd just never been told about, and I was about to bulldoze my father's memory by getting angry over it. I almost let the whole thing go right there, but something kept nagging at me. That old footpath Ruiz described was a narrow line along the back corner, nowhere near where Karen's stake was planted, and nowhere close to the size of an expansion with a laminated sign and a board vote behind it. So I started pulling HOA meeting minutes. They're public record if you know to ask for them. And that's when the first real crack showed up. The neighbor signatures Karen had shown me weren't from a vote on expanding a trail. They were collected under a petition titled "Support Our Community Against Outside Development," which 2 separate neighbors told me, when I actually asked them directly, they'd signed thinking it was about blocking a cell tower near the elementary school. One of them, a woman named Priya, looked genuinely embarrassed when she realized what her signature might have actually been used for. I'll admit, I sat on that information for almost a week without knowing what to do with it. So I did the simplest thing I could think of. I put up a trail camera. Told myself I was just trying to catch whoever kept snapping my vine ties, nothing more. 3 nights later, the footage showed me something I was not prepared for. It wasn't a thief. It was Karen, almost midnight, sitting on an overturned crate near my old tool shed. Phone pressed to her ear, and she was crying. Not performance crying, the real, ugly, shoulder-shaking kind. I caught fragments through the camera's audio, something about missing another payment, something about I can't lose the house too, something about her husband not being part of this anymore. I sat there in my kitchen at 1 in the morning, watching a woman I'd spent weeks building resentment toward fall apart on a security camera, and for the first time, none of this felt simple anymore. For a couple of days, honestly, I backed off entirely. I told myself maybe this whole expansion thing was just a desperate, badly executed attempt by someone underwater financially to get the HOA to absorb part of her land into a shared space she could somehow still profit from, or at least stop the bleeding. I almost convinced myself to just let her have the corner of the vineyard. People do messy things when they're drowning. Then, I found the county filing that changed everything again. Before the county finalized its survey, would reclassify that strip as shared HOA-controlled land instead of private property, which meant the county's compensation wouldn't go to me or to Ruiz or to Priya, it would go to the HOA's general fund. And buried in a separate filing, an LLC registered just 5 months earlier, with banking authority assigned to Karen Doyle, set up specifically to manage community infrastructure disbursements. So she wasn't just trying to save her house with a vague half-plan, she'd built an actual mechanism to redirect county compensation money, real money owed to real neighbors, through a fund she alone controlled. The crying on the camera was real. The desperation was real, but so was this. I needed to know who the man was, because there had been a man weeks earlier, the night I'd first put the camera up, meeting her at that same shed, handing her a folder. I'd assumed developer, I'd assumed corruption for hire. I was wrong, and the truth was almost sadder than the lie. He was her brother, Russ. I found that out from, of all people, Mr. Ruiz again, who recognized him from a photo. Russ wasn't some operator. He was the one who'd helped her draft the LLC paperwork, the one who kept telling her this was the only way to keep the house, the one folder at a time pulling his own sister into something he probably told himself was just creative problem-solving, and not what it actually was. That changed how I felt about almost everything, but it didn't change what I had to do. Because real people, Ruiz, Priya, families who'd lived here longer than Karen had been HOA president, were about to lose money they were legally owed, funneled instead into an account controlled by one person 3 weeks before that same person ran unopposed for another term as HOA president. So I built the gate. Not where the old 99 footpath actually was. I left that corner untouched out of respect for whatever word my father had given decades ago, but directly across the new section she'd staked out, right where her expansion and the county survey line overlapped. Steel, locked, planted 9 days before the county's filing deadline and 11 days before the HOA election. She showed up the next morning, and for the first time, the calm cracked. She called me selfish, said I was punishing the whole neighborhood over a few feet of land, even brought up a lawyer. I almost told her everything I knew right there on my porch. I didn't. I just told her the gate was staying, and that maybe she should bring her own folder to the next open forum, because I was bringing mine. The week before the election, at the HOA's public forum, I stood up during open comment with copies of the county filing, the LLC registration, in 3 minutes of footage I'd trimmed down to nothing but timestamps, the shed, in the folder exchange with Russ. I left out the part where she was crying. That part wasn't anyone's business but hers. I just laid out where the compensation money was actually supposed to go and where it had been quietly redirected to instead. Nobody in that room said a word for almost 10 seconds. Priya, sitting 2 rows up, put her hand over her mouth. Karen didn't show up to defend herself at the next meeting. She didn't show up to the election either. When the votes were counted 4 days later, she'd lost by the widest margin in the HOA's history, 14 votes out of 211. The board froze the LLC's authority within the week, and the county, once they found out the land's classification had been quietly contested, fast-tracked direct payments to the actual property owners instead, Ruiz and Perea included. Here's the part I didn't expect, even from myself. I didn't tear out that gate and reclaim the whole corner out of spite once it was all over. I went back to Ruiz, and together we drew up an actual, legal, recorded easement for that original sliver of land my father had quietly handed over after the flood almost 30 decades ago. Formalized properly this time, on paper, with both our names on it, exactly the size it had always been, and not an inch more. The rest stayed mine. Stayed my father's, really. I heard Karen and her husband moved out of state that winter. I don't know what happened to Russ. Some mornings I still walk past that gate with my coffee, past the new, smaller, perfectly legal path beside it, and I think about how close I came to just being angry the whole way through this. Angry enough to miss that some of what she said was true, and angry enough, if I hadn't kept digging, to never find out how much of it wasn't. My father spent 30 years teaching those vines exactly how much room to grow into and how much to leave alone. Turns out, that was the lesson the whole time. I just didn't expect to need it for something other than grapes.